What's up, Internet? This is Rambling Josh, and today I want to talk a little bit about controls in video games. And specifically, I want to touch a little bit on what goes into making good controls and why it's so important. And this was kind of inspired a little bit by a specific trend that I've noticed in a lot of games recently, which it's not really a new thing, but something that's really been annoying me a lot personally of late. So I'll touch on that briefly along the way as well. So obviously, controls is a really big topic, and there isn't really a go-to way to this is how you make good controls, because it's such an insanely contextual thing. For one thing, it's going to vary a lot from game to game, so there isn't really a single silver bullet that's going to apply to every game. You can say there's best practices and stuff like that, especially if you go by genre, but it's still going to be very important to have your controls make sense for the game that you're making. And there isn't really a way to do that without just thinking a lot and playing the game a lot and seeing how it feels. But at the same time, that also leads us to the point where everyone's experience with the game is going to be a little bit different. So it's just really hard. It's a really hard process because, some people are going to be left-handed, some people are going to have motor function issues, and even beyond things like disabilities and accessibility options, everyone holds the controller a little bit differently. Even if I take say a PS4 controller, some people are going to hold it like that with their fingers on all the triggers. I personally tend to hold it like this, so that's not ideal, but that's just the way I naturally hold the controller, because I was brought up holding one of these that only has one set of shoulder buttons, so that's just how I've been trained to holding a controller for my formative years. Some people like to claw the controller, which if I can demonstrate. So a normal person holds the controller like that, right? Typically that's kind of the default, but I noticed that some people will go like that so that they can hit those buttons and these buttons. There's all kinds of different ways of holding a controller, and everyone is going to be a little bit different in their tendencies. So when you have a specific control scheme, it's just not going to work for everybody. And that's why it's important to get into things like remappable buttons and all that kind of stuff that hopefully we're seeing a lot more of in recent years because of accessibility things especially. Now, as far as why it's important to have good controls, that should be fairly obvious to anyone who's ever played a video game or even used an app on their phone or used a computer or anything like that. User experience is one of the most important things there is to creating an interactive medium. And with video games especially, I think this is more true potentially than any other medium. So you've got your controller, and the job of the controller is to communicate what's in your head to the game system. You press the buttons and you send the inputs to the game, and the game interprets them. But ultimately, the job of the controller is to almost disappear. If the controls are done properly, then after a little while, you ideally get to a point where you forget that you're even holding a controller, and it just becomes natural. You get the muscle memory, and you get to a point where you think it, and the controls are so natural that it just happens in game, more or less. You almost skip the step of the controller. And the harder it is to get to that point, the worse it feels, basically. Because if you have a control that's unintuitive, then you have to take an extra half a second to process, okay, well, I expect it to be on the Y button, but it's on the X button, so every time I want to do this thing, I have to remember, okay, I'm not pressing here, I'm pressing here. And that just increases kind of the almost the latency that it takes to perform any action, and that just feels unnatural. like if you've ever played a game that has like a lot of lag, like maybe like an online game, and there's a lot of lag because your command has to go to like to the server and then like to someone else and whatever, then maybe it's like I don't know, like say a 200 millisecond latency before your action can be processed, then you could probably feel that lag, right? And it feels really annoying, especially if you're getting into more like high performance type of thing. So if you're introducing that kind of like artificially into your game because your controls are unintuitive, then that feels really awful and it makes it unenjoyable. Because it takes you out of the experience, right? Because it's the opposite of that feeling of the action goes straight from your brain into the game. It's making the control medium all the more apparent, which is the opposite of what you want to do. And as far as what the like proper controls should be, like I've already kind of touched on the fact that that's not really a question that you can answer without kind of looking at the game that you're making very, very deeply and kind of answering it for yourself. But there's a few things that kind of go into it, because one of the things that's kind of interesting about game design is that one of the things that is very important that a lot of people may not even necessarily realize is the idea of the player's expectation. So sure, you can have this awesome game, but if you're subverting the expectations of the player too much, then that becomes a problem. So that's why you see a lot of times, maybe you have a health bar. That health bar is probably going to be either red or green. Maybe you have like shields. That shield is probably going to be it's probably going to be blue. Maybe like a purpley color, maybe a green or something like that. But your shield is probably never going to be orange or pink, because that's not something that you expect. And when you can build on the expectations of a player to kind of easily communicate a concept, then it really helps the player kind of get where you want them to be, where you want their headspace to be all the quicker. And the same is very much true of controls, right? You can kind of think of, okay, well, I've got my controller, so say I'm presented with a text box. What is the first button you're going to try if you're presented with a text box without context when you first start up a game? It's probably going to be A or B. Realistically, it's only ever going to be one of those two options. When was the last time you cleared a text box by pressing L or select? It's happened before, I've seen it. But it's never really kind of like the primary button for that. It's not the first thing you think of. And so if you're making it something that players don't expect, then that's inserting again that kind of like artificial latency into the player processing their action. So what it kind of comes down to is, if you're going to subvert the player's expectation in that, then you kind of have to make a evaluation of it, so that you can kind of determine, I'm losing this, but like how much am I gaining by putting it on a button that people are not going to expect it to be on. And this whole thing actually kind of goes into, it reminds me a little bit of the idea of the original PlayStation. I don't have a PS1 controller on me, but here's my PS2 controller. I remember hearing that when the PS1 controller was originally created, the intention was that you've got the face buttons here, right? And there's kind of this, they were labeled the way that they were, almost to kind of indicate parts of the body. Like the triangle button is kind of like the head, the X is the feet, and the square and circle are like the right and left arms, in a manner of speaking. And the intention was that they were kind of roughly thinking, if we can correlate the buttons on the controller to the parts of a body, then that makes a more natural feel for the player when they are using the buttons. And obviously the actual controls of a game come down to the developer, not down to Sony Japan. But it's just kind of like one of those things that you go into thinking, right? Like the top button on the controller, whether it's triangle or it's a Y or it's an X, depending on what controller you're using, because X is on the top here, but Y is on the top here. But that's usually going to be like your menu button or something like that, right? It's going to be kind of like an auxiliary button that does something that's less often used, but is still probably important. Stuff like that. And now, as for kind of the trend that I've seen that kind of like inspires this is, it's kind of frustrating to me that I've seen a lot of games not all of them are necessarily new games, but a lot of games recently that are really kind of like dense. Their control setup is really dense, just to use the word dense again. And what I mean by that is that it's almost kind of like the controls are almost too used. Like there's so many, you have so many buttons on the controller, and every single one of them is used for something. One of the worst examples that I've actually seen of this in recent memory is actually Breath of the Wild, because it does a lot of the things actually that I've already mentioned. It takes the expectations of previous 3D Zelda games and it really subverts those. It's been a while since I played Breath of the Wild, but like the attack button is on a different button. I think the roll button is on a different button. Shielding works differently than it has before. And then you have a lot of these, like the shoulder buttons all do kind of weird things. Like you have some shoulder buttons bring up menus that are like a contextual sliding menus. Some buttons bring up other different contextual sliding menus. Different buttons do different things when you're in different menus, all this kind of stuff. And it's like, this all kind of, it feels very cluttered. It's like if you don't play the game for like 20 or 30 hours to like get a good feel for these controls, then you're constantly pressing the wrong buttons. And that just goes straight into what I was talking about before, about the like unintuitive controls, where you're kind of like artificially enhancing the latency. And even beyond that, a lot of times what ends up happening is maybe you can't take that time to process what the correct button is, or maybe you just can't remember offhand what the correct button is, so you press the wrong button, and that's even worse, because that pulls you out of the experience even more, because it's not even that you took too long to press the right button for it to be fun. It's you actually pressed the wrong one, not because you fumbled it, but because you had the action in your head that you wanted to do, and the medium that was trying to translate that action into the game just failed. That's not necessarily your failure, that's like the controls failing. And I guess the question becomes, so what could Breath of the Wild have done to not have those problems? What could other games like Monster Hunter has a lot of issues, I think, with its controls as well. I'm told that the Ori and the Blind Forest Definitive Edition has issues with its controls as well. And when I say issues, I mean all these games have a lot of like button bloat. And there isn't really an easy answer to that, because when you have a lot of things that you need to do, you kind of need a button to do them with. So there isn't really a clear-cut solution. And I'm not coming to this video with like, this is how you fix the problem. I'm not going to presume that I'm smarter than the Nintendo developers who were designing this game for years and years and years. But I'm saying that it's a problem. I'm saying that if you're making a game, you don't necessarily have to have something that you want to use often on every button on the controller. You look at a game like Dive Kick, and it's literally a 2-button game, and people consider that to be a good game. You look at a game like Super Metroid, and that uses potentially every button on the Super Nintendo controller, depending a little bit on how you play, but you can literally use every button on the controller, and you can remap them all. And that is a game that I've never felt like had button bloat. So it's very clearly something that you can work around. It's something that has solutions. It's not always easy, obviously, and maybe there isn't ever a good solution. Like in a game like Breath of the Wild, there is a lot of things that you can do, and those are all good things to be able to do. They all add to the game. So maybe, in the end of the day, maybe they did reach the best decision that they could have, but it's something that if you're making a game that you have to be very cognizant of, because controls are very important, and there are a lot of ways to get them wrong.